Okay, well, here we are on page 91 of our textbook, and I'm going to talk about how to do a full interpretation of a text. And I'm going to keep this pretty brief and pretty simple because I don't want you to make it too complicated, all right? Let's keep this really simple. So on page 91, here at the top, it talks about the four parts, or the four things that we're going to look at. One of them, the first one is called the language text. The second one is called literature genre. The third is culture context. And the fourth is called critical or creative interpretation. So let's talk about the first one, the language text. Okay, here's what we're looking for. We're going to ask ourselves the question, what kind of a text is this? Is it a short story? Is it a poem? Is it a part of a larger story? Is it maybe one book in a series of books, or one movie in a series of movies? Okay, is it a speech that somebody gave? Is it a drama, a theatrical performance? Is it an animation like a cartoon? What kind of a thing is it? Okay, does it have images? Does it have music? Does it have other kinds of things that will draw your attention? Is it somebody, like one person talking, giving a speech? Is it a dialogue between two people? Or is it a live performance versus something that was scripted or written ahead of time? So I want you to think about what it is. Okay, I'll give you an example. Shakespeare wrote a lot of his stories as theatrical performances, and they were later changed into books and changed into movies and changed into other things. If we remember how they were originally meant to be viewed by people, it was folks in the theater watching a performance. Okay, so it's important that we take a look at and we contemplate what the text is. If we're not sure, it's a good idea to look it up. We also want to take a look at how the language is being used. Especially in today's age, we have a lot more options than they did maybe a few hundred years ago. But did they use a formal script writing? If you think about Chinese or Japanese characters are very artistic in nature. We have something in English called calligraphy. And calligraphy is a very formal style of a beautiful type of writing. How are the words arranged on the page? You'll see poetry sometimes where the words are shaped in a specific way. Is it, again, an oral, or was it meant to be oral? Was it meant to be something spoken out loud, or is it more visual? If you look at some important speeches like Martin Luther King, he gave a speech called I Have a Dream. And the speech in and of itself is excellent, but his voice, his rhythm, the patterns of his speech, the I have a dream repeated itself. His voice quality was amazing. He knew how to speak to his audience. So when you look at things, try not to just look at black letters on a white page. Try to pull it out a little bit and say, what is it? And what was it supposed to be? And just take a look at how they're presenting you with the information. Okay, so that's the language text part. Now, let's go down to the next one, on the next page of our book. It's this literature genre. And one of the things you're going to ask about this, is there anything literary about this? Is it special? That's a good way to look at it. Is it special? There's lots of books in the world, but there's only a few that are really, really good. Think about it just in the last few years, what books have been very popular, like the Harry Potter series, for example. For some reason, those caught on and everybody was reading them. I remember a few years ago, the Twilight series, the vampires and the werewolves, and that was real popular. But the question is there anything literary about this? Anything special, imaginative, playful? Is there something there that is worthy of our attention? And it also talks about genre. And of course, genre really has to do with the category of, or the type of story that you're telling. For example, Star Wars, which is a very popular series of movies, fits into the science fiction genre. Okay, so all stories that have to do with space travel and future and technology, those are going to be in the science fiction. Whereas you have things like The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, written by J.R.R. Tolkien. those are going to be more of a fantasy genre. They're an imaginary place, an imaginary world that was created. Those are going to be, Harry Potter is going to be in the fantasy realm as well. So when we look at this, we're going to ask ourselves the question, what are we reading? Are we reading a romance? Are we reading poetry? Are we reading a tragedy? Is it a drama? Is it fiction, science fiction? Is it an autobiography? What kind of genre does this fit into? And then, if possible, you want to look at subgenres. So something might be, it might be a comedy, but it might be a tragic comedy. In other words, it's the bad things that happen in the story that are ironic that make it a comedy of sorts. So there's some subcategories that you can look for. And if you don't know them, don't worry about it. But you want to look as carefully as you can and try to figure out what's happening and what category does it fit into. Okay, that's a good exercise. And as soon as you recognize something, it's really important. I want to make a note of this. It's important that you understand humor and that you understand sarcasm, because sometimes people write a story or they write about something and they're being sarcastic. In other words, what they say is kind of funny, and you listen to them and you go, man, do they really mean that? And then you realize they're being sarcastic. It's important, especially when you're talking about politics, you're talking about religion, you're talking about a lot of things that people happen to be very passionate about. You have to pay attention to tragic comedies or things that have to do with sarcasm. I just want to make sure you pay attention to that. The third piece here is called culture, content, or context. And it really is talking about the culture. What culture is being shown in the story? Shakespeare often said his story is in Italy, and so we need to look at where is it at, what place is it, what culture is it, what group of people is it. So it's important that we know what it is we're looking at. Okay, and so there's all kinds of sub pieces to this, but that's pieces like. What social issues are being dealt with, what sexual or sexuality issues are being dealt with, what about things with the family, ethnic or racial, religious, educational. Those are all issues that people can write about or they can put into their story to create tension or create drama or create some sort of a situation. We also need to know what the purpose of the story is. For example, I read a book here not too long ago, and it was written by a pastor of a church, and he was writing a book about how to motivate you to live the kind of life you want to live. It's kind of a self-help book, although it really wasn't self-help. It was more about God's help. But the point is, it was meant to motivate and inspire somebody to live differently. It was speaking to me as a human being, not just as a reader, but it was directed towards individual people's lives. That's different than reading Harry Potter. I'm not a participant in Harry Potter, whereas in a self-help book, I would be a participant. So you want to ask yourself, what are we talking about? Okay, we have our culture. Now we're going to look at the context. Am I supposed to be participating in the content? Okay, so again, you want to look at the purpose of it, the culture of it, and the thing I want to make a point here too. Imagine this. Imagine I read a story about World War II, and the story was written by a German Nazi member. That story would sound very, very different than if I read a history book written by somebody who was from France during that time. Right? Because they're going to be looking at the same event, but they're going to be looking through different eyes, and they're going to have a very different tone about it. It's really, really important that you understand the culture and the context of what you're reading. Okay? Imagine if I read a history book about the history of South America, written by men from Spain. That would be a very different kind of book than if I read a history book written by somebody who was native from Ecuador. They would have a different story to tell about the Spaniards coming to South America. Okay? So take some notes on those three sections so that you know what you're going to be looking for. All right? And then you're going to take a look at your text, your story, whatever it is that you're reading. And here's the activity that we're going to do. Okay? You're going to do a creative rewrite of your story. A creative rewrite of your story. Okay, now, what are we doing? We talked about an initial analysis before, and we asked all these questions: who, what, when, where, why, what if, etc. We asked about what do we notice, how do we feel, what patterns do we see, and are there any contrasts in the story. That was our initial analysis. When we do this creative rewrite, what we're going to do is we're going to look at all of these aspects, and we're going to rewrite the story, but we're going to change some of the critical components. Okay, for example, imagine if I wanted to do a creative rewrite of, of Lord of the Rings. Okay, and I wanted to set it in the Amazon of Ecuador. What would that look like? How could I redo Star Wars within the content of, or the context of, the Amazon and maybe native people and the conquistadors and other folks? And what would that look like? I mean, obviously you wouldn't have lightsabers at this point. You'd have spears and blow darts. But I'm going to retell the story in a completely different way. I'm going to tell the same story, but I'm going to do it in a different way. In other words, the main ideas are not going to change. The purpose of the story is not going to change. For example, if I'm writing a story about Romeo and Juliet and the love of two young people, and by the way, in that story they were probably 13 or 14 years old. If I want to tell a love story between two teenagers, and I wanted to do that here in Ecuador, what would that look like? Keeping the same components, the same ideas, the same main points, but telling it in a different place and in a different time. Changing a lot of the details, like rewriting the place, the who, the when, the where, creating new details. Okay? So you're going to take a story, you're going to tell the same story, but you're going to do it with all different details. Okay? So if we look here in our book, it gives you some stuff in here to take a look at. But I don't want to go through all of the pieces, but think about how you're going to change your story. Okay? The who, what, when, where, why, what patterns, what things are you going to keep the same, so that when I read your story, I know that you're retelling Robinson Crusoe, or you're retelling Pride and Prejudice, or you're retelling the story of Dorian Gray. How do I know it's that story, just rewritten in a different way? So I want you to think hard about these details that you're going to change, that you're going to keep. All right? Now, having said that, your story doesn't need to be very long. It's going to be actually rather short. In fact, I would like it to be around 250 to 350 words, not anymore. Okay? This is not meant to be a long writing exercise. What I'm looking for is to see if you can maintain the purpose of the story, but changing all the details around it. Okay? So that's the point. Now, having said that, go back through and look at your stuff and see what you want to do, which things are going to change, which details are going to remain the same, how do you keep the theme of the story intact, and what details are going to be different. All right? So, having said that, go read your story, do a little homework, read some summaries, watch a movie about your book or your story, do what you got to do. And then once you feel like you have a good grasp of what the story is telling you, then you're going to do this critical or creative rewrite. And as always, if you need any help, just give me a call, send me a text message, let me know, and I'm glad to help. All right, enjoy.